The seminar will soon begin. Please take a seat and mute your cell phone. Let's welcome the moderator, Kanal Maxi.
Welcome back, everybody. A very good morning session with a very interesting keynote followed up by a fascinating panel. And this afternoon we're going to extend and build on this discussion about decolonisation. We're very lucky to have a very interesting keynote speaker this afternoon, followed by another very interesting panel. I'm going to keep the introduction very short to allow more time for the presentation and a few questions at the end. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Wayne Modeste, who has worked in Jamaica, in the United Kingdom, and now in the Netherlands, where he's the head of content at the World Cultures Museum in Rotterdam. And the title of his presentation is Decolonisation as Infrastructure. Can the museum be decolonised? Wayne Modeste.
I want to thank you for inviting me. I must admit that I have done this probably 6 times already, because I find it very hard to record a talk. That said, I would have loved to have been there with you all, but my agenda just could not allow me to travel at this point. Also because it would help me to engage in a conversation rather than talking to a screen, which I find enormously difficult. I want to also thank the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this and inviting me at this point for this kind of discussion, because I think that it is such an urgent thing that we are struggling with as institutions right now. For me, institutions, museums inhabit a very uncertain space. It is an uncertainty that one sees in the rising criticism about our role within society, and what I see through the lens of a scholar with whom I think sometimes, Stuart Hall, and what he would call the conjuncture, this political moment, and what this moment itself offers as threats, but as opportunities. So in a way, one of the things that I'd like to think with you today is what threats do decolonization bring, but what opportunities it also brings for us to inaugurate a different kind of institution for the future. So I want to congratulate the organizers for this already. What I'll do is I'll read a little, but I'll also just talk through some of my experiences, and forgive me if I ramble. My rambling is, it's part of just how I think. I'll start out with the 2 quotations that I think are important for us to think with. One is from Tokan Yang, from an article of about 2011, I think, where it's called Decolonization of a Metaphor. And the other is from a publication by Saidiya Hartman called Lose Your Mother, I think, where she was trying to think through slavery and its afterlife in the present. And I think both open up for us a thinking about what animates my interest today. Why are we in this place? Why the demand for decolonization? And especially after about 30 years of diversity initiative and diversity policies, after the new museology movement, one could say that started already in the 1980s. Why are we still here demanding a certain kind of decolonization? My suggestion is that the long history of shifts and change that has been happening in the museum, changes that have been happening in the museum, have not necessarily fully addressed the infrastructure, the systemic ways in which race, coloniality, inequality is embedded in the institution. Rather, it has been at that top level of change that actually resuscitates the system that that the museum is or has been. So first, Tokanian. Yet, they say, this kind of inclusion is a form of enclosure, dangerous in how it domesticates decolonization. It is also a foreclosure, limiting in how it recapitulates dominant theories of social change. When metaphor, they say, invades decolonization, it kills the very possibility of decolonization. It recenters whiteness, it resettles theory, it extends innocence to the settler, it entertains a settler future. And second, from Saidiya Hartman, if slavery persists as an issue in the political life, it is not because of an antiquarian obsession with bygone days or the burden of a too long memory, but because Black lives are still imperiled and devalued by a racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. This is the afterlife of slavery, she says. Skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, to museums even, I would say, premature death, incarceration, impoverishment. So this paper is invested in us thinking about the museum as a part of that political arithmetic and racial calculus that was entrenched centuries ago. It is about how we as institution are conscripted in a politics of diversity or even of a happy decolonization, and I will explain that later, that extend this innocence of the settler and that continues to entertain a settler future. As we are all aware, decolonize as a term, as a concept, has reemerged recently to describe demands, the diverse demands for and practices of institutional change. While institutions, like many of us here, but definitely my institution, have tried to claim the term as our own, we must admit that it is grassroots in activists' initiatives, grassroots mobilization, including Decolonize's place in the US, or Decolonize the Museum in the Netherlands, or even Berlin Decolonial in Germany, while on other initiatives across Europe and America that have led to the demand for decolonizing the museums, for decolonizing universities and archives, as well as curricula, methodologies, and even disciplines. For many of these activist mobilization, decolonization has or was an answer to the failure of diversity policies implemented by institutions that, as feminist scholar Yvonne Benschop suggests, have failed in their attempts to confront issues of social justice. Benschop argues here that the challenge of diversity is much more than a change in terminology from categories like gender, ethnicity, age, and class to the more encompassing and concealing term, diversity. And I want to emphasize that diversity as a concealing term. She continues, in contrast to gender or other categories of identity, which are often represented as sources of social inequality in organization, diversity does not so powerfully appeal to our senses of social justice. And I want to remind us actually that within many of the political spaces across Europe anyway, and in America, I must say that my talk here reflects what my own position location from the Netherlands, that we often dismiss claims based around marginalization and marginalized groups, around question of gender, ethnicity, age, or class, and especially around questions of racialized belonging as identity politics, which I think is an easy foreclosure of the possibility of the discussion of how access is denied through practices of racialization or gendered practices. Indeed, if diversity was the language and policy framework through which more equitable and just institutions or societies were to be formed, for many activists calling for decolonization, these initiatives had fallen trap to the exercise of tick boxing. Diversity on these accounts had been conscripted to a neoliberal, reductive, multicultural politics that served to govern difference, rather, while centralizing white, male, cisgender norms as fulcrums around which all difference was to be measured. Diversity for these activists had failed. We needed to decolonize. It is not my intention in this brief presentation to review the long history of diversity policies, including in the Netherlands. Many of you would have already known about these. Many of you in the audience would also have already known of the criticism of the many diversity policies that have emerged over the years. I want to, within the Netherlands, for example, we could trace back these questions of diversity policy at least to the 1990s, coinciding with many of the discussion around the questions of multiculturalism and the multicultural society, and the ways in which there were discussions around that, around social cohesion, inclusion, in which museums were also a part. And the ways in which actually much of this discussion on multiculturalism was pronounced dead by many polities across Europe, that the possibility of a plural society was announced dead, whether or not it is through politicians in England or Germany or in the Netherlands. For many in the museums and heritage sector in the Netherlands, for example, these questions were tied to the Code of Cultural Diversity that emerged in the 2000s, and the ways in which we would measure ourselves as institutions as to whether we are diverse enough by looking at what we call the 4 Ps, our personnel, our programming, our partners, and I need to remember the other one, but it's not coming to me right now. My interest is not in rehearsing this history. My interest is rather in foregrounding the question of failure and how these policies have seemed to fail us, or at least in the ways in which we have actually been able to structure institutions that are more inclusive or have changed to be more welcoming to others. Hints of this failure was what I wanted to address in the opening quotes that I gave. However, if one were to want to rehearse this, one could go back to the work, for example, of Sarah Ahmed and her wonderful critique of the question of being included over and over again, or the ways in which diversity talk works to ground particular frameworks of thinking, particular normative understandings of institutions, or the work of, for example, the amazing work of Sumaya Kasim in that article that circulated over 5 years or so ago, thinking about the impossibility of the decolonization in institutions, as well as the work that she had done with the museum in Birmingham. My ultimate aim, however, in this talk is to think through what might decolonization look like in relationship to earlier policies, and how decolonization may be able to inaugurate a different kind of institution that does not settle futures, but actually inaugurate futures of greater equity and justice for all peoples and not only some. I want to suggest that the earlier politics of diversity was one that often abstracted from the very politics around which it hovered: a colonial politics, a racial politics, a politics of normative understanding of how societies are, a colonizing politics that tried to push against a certain kind of or try to establish what I call a happy multiculturalism, a huggy multiculturalism that does not undo ongoing structures, but rather one that would like to decolonize with a hug. Before I go there, though, I want to open up two things. One, there are many of us who ask the question around the term decolonization and what it might mean. And for the audience that we are here today, I realize that some people might say, oh, but decolonization is not for me. It is for places that had settler colonial projects, such as the US, imperial colonial projects, such as in Europe, and there are other places which did not have colonialism in the same way. My understanding of decolonization, as imagined through the different activist projects that have happened, was that it was a much more capacious category, one that did not see coloniality as simply emergent out of an imperial colonial formation, but rather one that saw coloniality as the afterlife of imperialism that has settled in the ways in which we understand the way we live today. And therefore, if one were to, for example, take Decolonize This Place and the project of Decolonize This Place as they imagined their activist formation in New York, then one would see how it ties questions of coloniality to questions of race, gender, climate justice, but even questions of gentrification, as it was mapped onto an unequal distribution of resources and life chances for marginalized, very often precarious peoples who were regarded as different from a white settler norm. Decolonization in this framework then is not just about thinking the moment of colonization into emancipation and the decolonization movement that happened, for example, from the 1940s onward, but rather the embedded structure of colonial understandings, including the ways in which the colonial understanding that structure the world in which we live, even as in older formations such as first and third world, overdeveloped, underdeveloped, developing world. So it was a category of thinking about equity and justice for all. That's one thing. The second part of what I'd like to do before I go into a few examples for us to think with, and what I mean is to think about the question, why I want to think through the question of decolonization and infrastructure. Now, for those of you in the social sciences and humanities and who are academics, much more than me, who is a museum person, you will know about what has been called the infrastructural turn in the social sciences and humanities, and the ways in which certain scholars, for example, in urban anthropology or geography, have been thinking about infrastructure, the way, how to think infrastructure in the distribution, unequal distribution of inequality. By infrastructure there, they were more interested in, as I understand it, in roads, social technical systems, some people would call it, roads and bridges and gullies and whatever, and how one could understand or use those structures, infrastructures, as a way of understanding the world we live in, and how those help us to distribute life chances. While that is important for me, as I'm interested as well in thinking about the museum as an infrastructure, as a part of a social technical system that animates the ways how life chances are distributed. I wanted to take infrastructure in another way. I wanted to understand it as both the intellectual as well as the practical systemic modes through which we organize museums, whether in conservation or in exhibitioning, or even in the question of the intellectual infrastructure on which the museum is based. So this is an ethnographic museum, or this is an art museum, or this is a history museum, and how those different disciplinary frameworks around which the museum is based continues to divide the world into those one side of the world as whether or not it is those people who are primitive or primitive craft, art, whatever, and the other side of the world, those people who have art, history, that kind of thing. That for me is perhaps the most important in terms of thinking about the infrastructure. As we, in my museum anyway, continue to ask, what does it mean to be ethnographic as opposed to be contemporary art? What does it mean to be ethnographic as opposed to be historical? In that sense, I want to just think through a set of examples, and you might, as ways of thinking how we think infrastructure. What might it mean to think conservation, its norms and practices, its modes of care, its modes of imagining preservation as part of an infrastructure of inequality? Or conversely, is it possible to think conservation as rather an infrastructure to facilitate the redistribution of care, not only for collections, but also for communities, as well as thinking through the ways in which, for example, and I've heard this by others, I've said it myself, that conservation itself can be a stumbling block for restitution, and therefore a stumbling block or a way of keeping the current museological form of who can care for and who must be cared for in terms of objects and collections. It is that I'm interested in. Now, many of you, I would have said this to some of you before, so you would have heard it before, but many of you would have heard the example that I've given, where I riffed on an earlier idea of my work in the Caribbean and the ways in which within the Caribbean and in Jamaica where I worked, we were always so invested in trying to keep the norms of conservation. Because these norms come down to us when I used to live there as certain rules and regulation, as certain forms and structures that we needed to live by, that we needed to uphold if we were actually to accede to, that we were actually to live up to the call that was being made by ICOM, for example. And so for several years while working along with other thinkers around conservation in Jamaica, I remember the ongoing struggle that I felt in trying to stick to the norms of what is the right temperature? How do I keep those temperature and relative humidity? How do we ensure that objects live forever in that context of a Caribbean that is always humid and that is always hot, but one that always also was not as wealthy enough to be able to implement the systems that we were capable of, we felt that we were required to keep up. Now I know that this might be an old-fashioned way of thinking conservation, because at the time when we were thinking this, that was already in the 2000s, we were already aware that there had been much changes in the thinking around what conservation could be or could become. And yet, I want to still ask the question, how many of us still place that norms of preservation as a kind of requirement for who can care for objects and where objects can be cared for best? One of the things that animated our discussions while I was in Jamaica anyway was a series of returns of objects that people there wanted. I will not call out names of which object it was. I've written about it otherwise, but that those objects could never be returned because of the possible failing of us being able to achieve those conditions. But in this sense, that is only a pragmatic notion of the infrastructure. I'm also interested in just the very notion of what is to be preserved and the idea of preservation. What objects are allowed or should be allowed to live forever, or what objects should die, should disappear. And here again, I want to give you another example. When I was in Jamaica, I was part of a project working on a masquerade tradition called Jonkuno. And I remember us trying to acquire an object. It was it's a mask that you dance, and you dance it on your head. And at the end of the dance, the group that dances the object, it should be destroyed. It's a natural part of the process of its destruction. And I remember us in the museum wanting to preserve it. Also because there was a similar object in the American Museum of Natural History that was preserved. It has been there since 1919, collected by this collector called Martha Beckwith. And it's in a terrible condition, I must tell you. But the one in Jamaica was new, we had commissioned it, and we wanted to keep it. And therefore, we actually paid the community to stop that process where it should have been destroyed. And eventually, what happened was there was a lot of unsettling in the community. There was a lot of criticism of us. Eventually, the objects died a natural death when it was eaten by insects. But what interests me here is the ways in which this desire for preservation also, we had that desire for preservation that would suggest that we stop the life cycle of the objects in an attempt to keep it forever as record. It is that I'm interested in. What happens when conservation, not only as a practice, but also as a way of thinking, is part of the structuring of who keeps, who is allowed to preserve, what is returned. I'm interested in that. And it is there that I'm thinking through the question of the infrastructure on which our institutions are based. My second example would be a legal infrastructure and the question of what we often use is also in the restitution conversation about it was the law at the time. And here I am drawing on a large project that we are now working on. You can look at it online, called Pressing Matter, where we are interested together with colleagues such as Walter Verhart and a wonderful, amazing student, Elspeth Decker, we've been thinking about the question about what legal framework have been put in place to be able to govern who keeps what object and what, where, when we say it was the law at the time, what does that mean? But how that legal framework is also a part of sometimes the foreclosure of a possibility of return and restitution sometimes. So one of the things that we've been toying with in this, or thinking within this, was one important thing. Is the legal infrastructure around which, or the legal frameworks around which our conversation around it was the law at the time, not similar to the legal framework that was embedded in the colonial project, and therefore that was also embedded in the racialized project of creating the racial categories around within the colonial hierarchies. So how do we unpack, unhinge the category of international law and heritage law that would make it, or made it possible for objects to come to us, for objects to be in our collections, for objects to be taken in times of war, but also the legal frameworks around questions of illicit trafficking. How do those legal instruments continue, or how did they shape the ways in which objects now, so many objects are in European museums in relationship to other places such as the Caribbean or Africa? And what might it mean to see these as the infrastructure of immobility of objects? Actually, if you were to think about it, it's also the same infrastructure of immobility of peoples, because in many cases, the same people from whom objects are here in Europe and European museums are very often the same people who need visas to travel to Europe when we don't need visas to travel to these countries. So what is that legal intellectual framework on which the idea of international law is based? And how does that perpetuate a certain kind of coloniality of ownership, the coloniality of the right to preserve, but also the coloniality of the distribution of heritage in certain spaces and not other spaces? Might thinking through the legal infrastructure help us to inaugurate a different kind of heritage distribution? And might thinking that in relationship to the racialized history of law and the international legal framework also help us to think again about questions of restitution and redistribution? My colleague Walter Verhart and Elspeth suggest that one of the caution that they want to place within the question of restitution today is that one of the things that we do is that we say that these discussion must be moral, ethical discussion and not legal discussion. And by excluding the law, what we might do is exclude the very nature in which the law has been the infrastructure on which we have been able to take, but also to keep objects within our museums. And my final thinking around infrastructure is what I alluded to in the beginning. Because if there is anything, and this is what I think of as the epistemic, intellectual framing, systemics on which the museum is framed, it works. I'm interested in how institutions like ours emerged around issues of ethnography, art, history, and the ways in which ethnography was a category for thinking about those people in a particular place that was not Europe, that was not white, and the ways in which that same conversation around an ethnographic museum in the present continues these modes of thinking about a divided world. For us in my museum, that has immense consequences. It is the consequence of where does contemporary art happen? What is the temporality of the contemporary in relationship to modern and tradition? But it is also embedded in the collections policies that we try to create in our institutions when we think about what is art, what is design, what is craft, which places has art or design or fashion, and which places have textile, dress, and craft. For me, a part of the decolonial project is also embedded in the very categories of the institutions that we inhabit today, that seem to perpetuate the kind of divided world which creates a hierarchy of making, a hierarchy of doing, but also creates temporal distancing between who is contemporary, when is the contemporary, when is tradition. And one of the things that we're interested in, where a colleague of mine and many of others have been doing a book that is coming out hopefully this year about temporality, that it is actually within the infrastructure, intellectual infrastructure, that we struggle, or this intellectual infrastructure, that we struggle with ideas of why we still make the distinction between those people who are traditional and almost feel that tradition cannot live in the present, that tradition must be passed. So embedded in this infrastructure is also a temporal idea about developed, underdeveloped, overdeveloped, or who is contemporary, that kind of thing. It is that I mean by taking decolonization, not just in a politics of recognition that would include others, that would include me in a European institution where some would say I am also other, but rather a kind of politics of a real capacious thinking about the very foundations on which the institution is based, so that we can unravel these foundations to create an institution where diversity can flourish, where plurality is a possibility, rather than thinking that there is a West, a us that knows, and an other that must be a certain, that we must help or educate. In many ways, one could suggest that the restitution debate still has its foundation in that kind of discussion. A decolonial project would take the politics of recognition and the politics of redistribution together to unravel an institution that would create a future we share with each other, and also think about the planet, but also a future that is more equitable and just. This is what I want to share with you today, that decolonization must be a systemic exploration of the institutions to create a systemic solution for racism that is systemic, for the inequalities that are systemic, and inequalities that are systemic to the institution that colonialism created, but that coloniality continues to feed in the present. Thank you. I probably talked too much, but thanks.
Wayne, are you there?
I'm here.
It's Connell here, Wayne. Thanks for joining us early morning in the Netherlands. We're here mid-afternoon in Shanghai, and we've been sitting here listening to your wonderful keynote. And there's a lot of really erudite and rich ideas in there, Wayne. Thank you for sharing those ideas. I was really struck by your critique of the politics of diversity and representation and recognition, and moving to a much more critical analysis of the structures of the museum. You talked about infrastructure in terms of intellectual and practical infrastructures and practices, gave some great examples. And I wonder if I might ask if you could give us a few more examples of this kind of work you're doing in the Netherlands with these kinds of practical and intellectual infrastructures and the new kind of things that are opening up from that.
Hey, thank you, Conal. Are you hearing me?
Yep. Yes, we can hear you.
All right, brilliant. No, first of all, I'd say that this is a work that is being done by many people, and so I can give you a few examples. By the way, I'm really sorry I'm not there. It would have been wonderful. So one of the things that has happened in the Netherlands recently, and for which we kind of mobilized a group of people and published a book, was a book on the words that we use in our institution. And so we have a book we call Words Matter, and that we try to do collaboratively. And one of the things we were trying to do with that is the ways in which the very words that we use in the museum were framed in a particular way around certain colonial ideology. Who is a tribe? When do we use the word tribe? When do we use the word Inuit as opposed to Eskimo? How do we categorize objects based on that? And so we went into our databases mostly, because this was a problem we were having as an institution, where our exhibition makers and curators were saying, how do I describe? When do I use the word Indian as opposed to Native American? And so what we tried to do was, and we often say that we were not intended to be a word police. That's not it. But we were intended to have people look more critically at how words perpetuate a certain way of imagining the world and perpetuate a certain inequality in the world. Just the term, for example, that we use, whether we use third world or developed world or underdeveloped world, or now the global south, and what the global south actually means, south to what. So in that sense, that is one of the things we are interested in, and we take the words as part of the intellectual infrastructure, but also offering very practical solutions to, okay, how do you deal with that? How do you approach it? So that's one thing. The other thing that I alluded to, and which animates our interest, is, and probably it's just a simple thing for us, is we have a project going on now, which is we're doing with two scholars and practitioners of design, to ask the question, what would design histories look like differently if they were to take the bigger part of the world as the starting point, and not Europe and North America. And so how does that, what is at stake in that history? And so we have an internal process of thinking together, trying to think about objects, but also to think objects the ways in which the, 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 the larger world, the majority of the world, has been conscripted in design histories to write design history for Europe. And that is a small project of unpacking, unpicking, of thinking through categories again. But these are only some of the small ways in which we are trying to tease them out. And recently when we came together as a museum, which we merged in 2014, we moved away from having a curator for textiles to a curator for fashion, dress, and whatever, and popular culture, which helped us to also ask that question, use fashion as a traveling concept to think about what it might mean to think these things. So these are just some of the small examples that we're interested in to try and move things forward. And I can talk for many because I have 2 other projects that people can look on, and what is called Taking Care, where we critically look at care as a possibility that will also help think through questions of restitution. And what does it mean to care for people and not just care for objects? And there's another project called Worlding Public Cultures, which are all embedded in thinking differently about what the institution can be.
Thank you, Wayne. Are there any questions here from the floor or from online? I think we have an online question. So Wayne, a question from the audience. Thank you for your speech. The idea about the role of infrastructure in shaping the distribution mechanism or equity is really inspiring. I wonder if you have any suggestions or thoughts for people who are building a new museum. What can they do with their infrastructure from an early stage to avoid feeding coloniality?
Wow, that's an amazing question. And actually the person who asked that question is in a luxury position, because very often we are struggling with buildings that are so old. It is not so easy. No, I mean, one of the things, and I should thank my colleagues, Cindy Zalman, other people in the museum, we're now thinking about the development of a collection center. And that collection center, on the one hand, thinks through what it might look like to, and this is very simple. It thinks through, on the one hand, how do you care for objects? But one of the large part of the thinking is how do you ensure that you have massive spaces to think for and care for community? What does it mean to be able to facilitate that kind of just being joyous with things, being able to work with, come in contact with? So I think that for me, what happens when one takes the community as starting point and their flourishing as starting point as you build the infrastructure of the institution or the new building. And of course, we normally think about whether or not the truck can come in to bring the objects in. It's beautiful, but I'm interested in also how do we ensure communities come in. And I'll give you one even very practical and useless example. I would like you to ensure that, and I'm going to be really flat now, that you build a security infrastructure that when somebody who looks like me come in, I'm not assaulted by that security infrastructure because I do not look like what a curator or somebody else should look like. Simple as that. What is the security infrastructure that is not racial or racialized? Probably that is a little bit too blunt, but it is how my experience of going into a museum in London was. When the lady walked past me and she went to somebody else to walk them upstairs, and then she came over to me and in a beautiful sense of honesty, she says, "I'm sorry, you didn't look like what a curator normally looks like." What is the security infrastructure that makes your security guard not already think that some communities do not belong?
Fantastic. Thank you, Wayne. I think we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid, because we've got another panel coming up. But Wayne, your speech today, I think, was really foundational, to use your word, for our seminar, and will flow through into the rest of the discussions, including the panel that's coming up next. So please, everybody, join me in thanking Wayne Modeste for his keynote today.
Thank you. Thank you, Colonel. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Wayne. Bye.